Okay, hi everybody, and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. So today begins a new series of episodes when we are going to be talking about what I'm going to call the critical social justice movement. You may know this by any number of different names. Social justice, you may know it by the term wokeness. You may have heard people talk about critical theory or critical race theory or queer theory or fat theory, or any number of other something theories, all of which have come to permeate modern society, modern politics, the modern academy, the modern world at almost every level. And increasingly, it's becoming clear to me, at least, and to, it seems, lots of other people, that we are stuck with this for a couple of generations and we better figure out what it is and how we're going to respond to it. Now, the terminology is kind of tricky. I'm going to stick with critical social justice movement for reasons I'll explain in a few minutes' time. But just to give you a sense of what I'm going to be trying to do in these episodes, I've got two aims, basically. The first aim is to try and help us all to understand the philosophy and also the activism of this movement better than we do at the present time. And then critically important, and this is something I've not spoken about so much before, I've talked a little bit and written a little bit about understanding the movement previously, but I've not spoken about responding to it. And it's becoming increasingly clear that critical social justice ideology is making its way into so many different contexts, like workplaces, even like some churches. It's making its way into families. It's important for us to understand how we are supposed to respond to this ideology, which to many of us is a new thing, and we're unprepared for it. And so just responsible Christian discipleship means addressing this thing and trying to figure out what to do in the light of it. Now, many of you will know what I'm talking about, at least in broad terms. Some of you will not have a clue what it is I mean by critical social justice or the woke movement or anything of that sort. Now, if that's the case, I've got a couple of suggestions for you. First, please just sit tight, hold on for a couple of minutes, and I'm going to try and give you my outline, my brief outline at least, of the background and the key characteristics of this ideology and why it's so significant. And if that's the first you've heard of it, I hope it will become clear at that point why it is that I'm speaking in terms that suggest that this is a problem for Christians and it's a challenge that needs to be wrestled with. If, on the other hand, you do know roughly what it is I'm talking about, you won't need me to explain to you why this is something that Christians need to think about and start taking seriously. But I've got another suggestion for you. If this terminology is all very new to you, I've actually produced previously, back in 2020, a series of videos introducing what I called critical theory. I think actually the name critical social justice is a better term for it, given how it speaks about itself. But critical theory is basically the same background ideology. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can find a link to that playlist. It's 14 episodes and they're about 10 or 15 minutes each. So there's a fair amount to get through, but I hope it will be helpful, which outlines in much more detail than I'm going to be able to do here what it is that this movement actually claims. If you're listening on the podcast, then either the previous or the next episode on this podcast will be a compilation of all 14 of those previous YouTube videos. So either go back one or wait 2 days and just wait to see what comes. And you'll get a compilation of what I produced last year for folks here at All Saints Church, Presbyterian Church here in Fort Worth in Texas, which is my attempt to summarize and really in summarizing to critique this ideology. Because when you get to this level of anti-gospel thinking, description is critique to a certain extent. So hopefully that allows you at least to know how you're going to be able to orient yourself to what it is that we're going to be speaking about in the next few weeks. Now, just one more piece of housekeeping. I've alluded already to a YouTube video and a podcast. A few weeks ago, as most of you will know, the good folks here on the technical team at All Saints in Fort Worth started managing not just a YouTube channel, but also a podcast. So if you're watching this on YouTube and you would prefer to listen to it on a podcast, then just go down to the show notes, click on the link, and you'll find, Lord willing, a link to where you can subscribe to the podcast, or you can just search All Saints Presbyterian Church on your favorite podcast player. If, on the other hand, you're the other way around, you are listening to this on a podcast and you'd rather watch it or show it to other people or share it on video, whatever you want to do, then you'll be able to find it on the All Saints Presbyterian Church YouTube channel. Now, actually, the best place to go for all that stuff, it saves you looking in the show notes and scrolling down and fiddling around. Just go to www.allsaintskirk, All Saints Kirk, allsaintskirk.com. That's our church website, and click the link. It's on one of the images that takes you to the podcast, and you'll find there all the information you need. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. Apologies for that lengthy pre-introduction. Now, how are we going to be doing it? I'm going to be using this book, which is by a gentleman called Charles Pincourt, except that he's not Charles Pincourt. I'll tell you why in a second. And James Lindsay. Now, James Lindsay, you may have come across before if you've done any thinking or reading or study on this topic. Neither of these people are Christians. And Charles Pincourt, nobody knows who he is because he's writing under a pseudonym. I'll come to that in a sec. But the book is called Counter Wokecraft, a field manual for combating the woke in the university and beyond. Let me just say a little bit about the authors first. So Charles Pincourt, he says on the first page, I'm a professor at a large North American university. I'm writing this manual under the pen name Charles Pincourt, and nowhere does he say which university he is a professor of. Now, there's a clue as to why this ideology might be a problem. If the man writing a practical critique of it needs to keep not only his name, but the details of his employment secret, you will know if you've been paying attention to any of the media in recent months and even the last few years that people have been fired for less than what this guy says. And so it's entirely explicable that he'd want to keep his identity a secret. He's a professor of physics, he says. Professor of engineering. Of me projecting my scientific past onto him. He's a professor of engineering at a large university in the US. Nobody knows where. And I'm kind of glad for his sake he's kept his name secret, though it's interesting that he should feel he has to. James Lindsay will be well known to anybody who's done any reading, serious reading at least, or listening on this subject, partly because of this book. Let's grab it for you. Cynical Theories, written by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. That is easily the best single work on responding to critical theory, critical social justice ideology that I've come across. And on a recent podcast, James Lindsay runs a podcast, New Discourses. If you want to listen to more about this stuff, then New Discourses is the podcast to search for. And James pointed out, he gave a plug for this book recently in an episode, and he said that he's not really a co-author of this book. He's listed as a co-author, but the text, he says, is Charles Pincourt's, whoever he is. But Charles got in touch with James at an early stage of the publication of the book. They worked on it together, and so it was published under the imprint that James has just launched, New Discourses, just a month or two back, and James is listed as a co-author. But he emphasises both on that podcast and in the preface that really all the material, though some of it is derived from James's work, is Charles Pincourt's, and nobody knows who Charles is. Well, go figure. Now, just a couple of notes on this before I start taking you into it. This is the best practical guide that I've found for thinking through how to respond to critical social justice ideology. I'm afraid that the Christian responses I've seen, many of them are extremely superficial. And I think, this is something perhaps to talk about on another occasion, but it's striking and disappointing how often Christian responses to ideological problems are quite superficial. It display quite a shallow understanding of the issues, and it's well-intentioned sometimes. It's like, this is a problem, the gospel is the answer, but the diagnosis of the problem doesn't go very deep, and how exactly the gospel provides the answer is not spelled out in much detail. But in working through this book, my aim is to encourage you to get hold of a copy if this is a problem which you're facing. Now, I've got to acknowledge that it might be that your vocation or where you're living or the particular things you get up to during your working life or other parts of your life, it might be that there's such that this isn't really something you've come across. You've never heard any of the words I've just been talking about, or you have heard them, but you're pretty sure they're not going to be a problem where you live. Perhaps you run your own business or something like that. Well, if that's the case, then the Lord bless you, and I'm very, very glad that you're in one of those contexts where you're able to, in a sense, fight against this ideology by carving out a social and vocational niche where it's not a problem. That actually is one good response to it. But it should be recognized that it is actually, at least tacitly, a response. And it's not a response that everybody can make. So if you find these podcasts, it's like, well, this doesn't really seem to be relevant to me. Well, accept my apologies, if you would, in advance, that the next month or so of this podcast won't be so enjoyable or won't seem so relevant to you. I hope you find other good things to do with your time and come back and join us when we switch on to something else. But you might want to pay attention anyway, just in case, on the off chance it becomes useful either for you or maybe for somebody else in the future. Okay, let's jump into this book. Bear with me a second, coffee time. Okay, let's jump into this book. And I'm going to not read every paragraph or even anything from every section, but I want to lead you through it in such a way that I'm able to help you to get the best stuff out of it. And for reasons that will become obvious, it really is worth doing that. It's designed, Charles Pincourt explains, for universities. Now, the subtitle says that, the field manual for combating the woke in the university and beyond. Let me read from page 1, paragraph 1. The purpose of the manual is to help those who are concerned about the perspective, but who are not very familiar with it, those who understand that something is wrong but don't have the background to understand and resist the critical social justice takeover of our universities. So one of my aims then in working through it with you is to re-articulate what it has to say for different contexts. I guess you could kind of do it yourself. You could see how the sort of academic principles that are articulated here, or rather the principles that are articulated here that have relevance to academic contexts, could be applied to other situations like in business or in schools or even in churches, perish the thought, although it's becoming true, or in family relationships and elsewhere. But I want to try and do some of that work for you, or rather with you, just to try and make that leap. The second thing I want to do is I want to recognize that this is written by two guys who, certainly James Lindsay isn't a Christian and Charles Pincourt seems not to be. And so there are one or two shortcomings that rereading it or re-articulating it from a Christian perspective would allow us to overcome. Either things that, tactics that are morally questionable, or things that he's missed that he could have said if he were a Christian, or indeed one or two unfair criticisms of religion in general, which I think is just worth mentioning briefly, at least in passing. So that's what we're going to be doing, working through this. Now, let me give you a brief summary of the book. It's got 3 chapters. It's really thin. I mean, it's like 90-something pages. And the first chapter is a description of the woke ideology. The second chapter is a description of woke tactics, which, as we will see, are inseparable from the ideology. One of the biggest mistakes people make in approaching this whole area of study from the point of view of trying to critique it is to imagine it's just an ideology rather than an activist movement. It is an activist movement and not just an ideology. And so understanding Wokecraft, that is to say, how the woke go about their business, is actually a key to understanding the movement itself. And then thirdly, and this is the really significant contribution of this book, the third chapter lives up to the title, Counter Wokecraft. It is tactics and strategies for countering woke ideology, how people who are influenced by and seeking to push forward this critical social justice agenda go about their business, countering that, what they're up to in your business, in your school, wherever else it is. Let me read a brief paragraph or two from, actually no, I don't need to, I've just summarized it. All that is on page Roman 9 in the foreword by James Lindsay, so you can read that. Okay, so what I want to do now is briefly, I'm going to give you an overview of the strengths and weaknesses of the book, and if hopefully that will persuade you to press pause, or to, when you get home, to go and buy yourself a copy. And then I'm going to address one of those weaknesses by giving you a broad philosophical, historical overview of the movement, which this book doesn't do. And then I'll just read through his summary, Charles Pincourt's summary, and that will probably take us another 20 minutes. And by the time I've done that, you'll be ready to lie down in a darkened room or do something slightly more enjoyable. I have found myself at times, I mentioned this at the start of the previous series of podcasts that I mentioned before, videos, that I mentioned before, feeling like Jude the New Testament author who said, and this is paraphrasing slightly, I'd much rather be writing about Jesus Christ and the salvation he's won for us, but I've got to deal with all this crazy stuff which is cropping up in churches and tearing people away from their faith. That's honestly how I feel reading this. It is not enjoyable. It's not particularly fun doing these podcasts, but I'm afraid I think it has to be done. So anyway, enough rambling and waggling on the tee, as golfers used to say. Let me get into making a few comments about the strengths of this book and then its weaknesses. First, the first obvious strength, if you read through this book, it is clearly grounded in a very deep understanding of the issues. Okay, the guy clearly understands what he's talking about. It's written in in the way you'd expect a physicist or an engineer to write. All the sections and subsections are numbered like they would be in a scientific textbook, but that just makes it easy to navigate, and it gives it the feel of a field manual, I guess. There's a point that James Lindsay made. It's kind of he's a scientist as well, I guess. So, second thing to point out is it's a really dense text. So it's 93 pages, but it's pretty small type, and it's 93 pages of stuff that you need to think about. I don't know about you. I find myself frequently frustrated by 120-page Christian paperbacks where you can read sort of 20 pages and not feel like you've actually learned or even read anything. It's just waffle the whole time. And, well, this isn't like that. I mean, today I was reading again just page 4, 5, and 6, his brief summary of the woke worldview, and it's massively dense. And so this is one of the reasons why it's worth going through it in this kind of podcast format, because each paragraph you can expand on a little bit and just try and explore its implications, and it's worth thinking really carefully about. In other words, don't try and read this in 10-minute snatches in the dentist waiting room. Sit down with a pen and paper and actually work at it, and hopefully I'll be able to help you to do that. Above all, the third great strength, which I've hinted at previously, it is practical in orientation. Charles Pincourt gives concrete examples of the kinds of tactics that you are going to face as social justice activists try to take over your business. If you run a business, that's what eventually somebody is going to try to do unless this movement is stopped. And Charles Pincourt explains how they're going to do it. More than that, he explains how to respond, what you can do to actually win in the boardroom or in the discussion with the human resources manager or whatever it is. I've been listening to Aaron Wren recently, who's got some interesting, although sometimes it makes my eyes pop open a little bit, some of the stuff on his podcast. He points out that Christians often don't play to win. We play for scraps, he says. And I was listening to it and thinking, I think I see what you mean. There are times at which it's almost like we act as though we don't really believe we're in a battle. And we have to win against this. If we don't, well, I'm post-mill, so I think we are going to win. I'm not sure whether Aaron is. Maybe more on that another time. But this is an ideological and practical and activism-oriented conflict that we have to get into and have to be ready to not ignore, and we will need concrete suggestions for how to actually deal with that. And I'm delighted to say that it seems to me that Charles Pincourt is providing them. Okay, so briefly, weaknesses. What does this book not do? Well, the first thing it doesn't do is provide a really detailed historical, philosophical background to critical social justice. Now, that, in one sense, that's not criticism. It's 90-something pages. I mean, give the guy a break. The other reason why I don't think that's such a shortcoming is because this book, the one I mentioned before by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, does that very well. But that does so in 300 or 400 pages, which is the kind of depth you need to understand this. But what Counter Wokecraft does is it gives a very, very brief kind of synopsis of where the philosophical and historical background of this movement ends up in 2021. If you're familiar with linguistics, it's a little bit like the difference between a diachronic and a synchronic analysis of words. A diachronic analysis will take you on a long and tedious and exhausting route through the development of how words are used through time. That's what Lindsay and Pluckrose do in their book. What Pincourt does here is synchronic analysis, just telling you where we've ended up, how are words used now in linguistics, or what does this ideology mean now? And it means that it's not bad. It means it is actually simpler to understand if you can spend the time getting into the dense prose. But what it doesn't do is show you where this stuff comes from historically. So in a couple of minutes, I'm going to give you the briefest attempt that I can make to sketch that background for you, because I think it's important. And in a sense, it's a shortcoming of this book, but it would have taken another 20 pages and it might have derailed the overall purpose or duplicated some of the stuff in Lindsay and Pluckrosie's book to do that. So no great problem there. But please, please, please do be aware that you need to have some grasp of this in order to understand critical social justice thinking thoroughly. Again, just on the subject of understanding things thoroughly, the best stuff I found to read is by James Lindsay. It's a shame that the best stuff combating an ideology which is so avowedly anti-Christian is written by an unbeliever. There is some stuff by Neil Shenvi online, who's a Christian apologist. That's pretty good. But again, he doesn't really give the historical and philosophical background, although he's got quite a lot of stuff talking about engaging as a Christian. But I don't want to criticize it. He's doing a good job. I don't think he does. I don't think anybody does as good a job as James Lindsay does. And there is other stuff available written by Christians, and I haven't yet read anything that I think is really good. Maybe somebody's written something that I'm not aware of. Well, that'd be great. But the danger is we wade into these debates like a guy taking a knife to a gunfight, and then we wonder why we get kind of blown into the next street by the arguments we face. It's not good enough. Second weakness, and this actually is a critique of the book, there are one or two points at which Pincourt criticizes what he describes, I think, as a religious worldview. On page 5. And I'm afraid he just misunderstands, as you'd expect, somebody who's not writing from a Christian perspective. He misunderstands the ideological and philosophical depth and strength of a Christian worldview. And so he sort of dismisses religious worldviews along with superstitions of other kinds, as he would frame it, with a wave of the hand. And I don't think that means that the book is devoid of value. Far from it. It just means that he's mischaracterized the ideological and rational ground that he's standing on, and we need some kind of response at that level. But those are the weaknesses, really. Basically, it's a very, very good book. And so what are we going to do the rest of the time? Goodness gracious, 21 minutes. Okay, bear with me. What I'm going to do, two things. I'm going to give you my mad dash through the philosophical and historical background to critical social justice ideology, and that will serve belatedly as a description of the movement for those of you who still haven't got the first clue what I'm talking about. Apologies to you, okay? But it's coming. And then second, I'll go through how Pincourt characterizes the woke worldview. So, all right, if after that you still don't know, have the first clue what I'm talking about, then it really is my fault, and you should try and find something else more informative to listen to. But I hope that won't be the case, and I hope that by the end of this, you'll think, okay, I can see where this is coming from. I can see I need to get some handle on this. I can see it's going to be a problem if I don't get a handle on it. I'm going to get hold of this book by Pincourt, and I might even tune into the next podcast. All right, let's go. So where did critical social justice come from? You could trace it all the way back to the 16th century, but the most obvious immediate philosophical precursor to critical social justice ideology is Marxism. Marx taught people to define their identity on the basis of their membership of economic/social classes. On the one hand, there were the rich bourgeoisie, the oppressors in Marx's thought. On the other hand, Marx said, there are the poor workers, the oppressed. And your identity in the world, your place in the world, and all the things that you did were, in Marxian thought, defined by which of those two classes you were a member of. Were you a rich, oppressive, bourgeois overlord, or were you one of the poor, oppressed workers? And Marx, of course, if you've read your history, you will know that he encouraged the oppressed workers to rise up and overthrow their bourgeois oppressors. Now, that traces its roots right back to the middle of the 19th century. The promised Marxist revolution never came. And in the early mid-20th century, thinkers influenced by Marx were left scratching their heads as to why, with one or two very minor and brief exceptions, the workers didn't rise up to overthrow their masters. And there are a couple of reasons why they didn't do that. The first is that it turns out that Marx is wrong, actually, that people are defined in those terms, and that actually being one of those workers turned out to be a way in which people could have their lot in life improved. They could gradually, especially over decades and generations, move from being extremely poor to being less poor to being comparatively well off, and especially in countries where freer markets were allowed to operate, like in the West, people became rich compared to their forebears very, very quickly within the space of just a few generations. If you look at the increase in wealth from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, you'll see exactly what I mean in Western countries. And even in the countries in the East, broadly speaking, where Marxist political ideology still remained firmly in control, and people didn't have the economic and market freedoms that they had, for example, in America and in Britain and in parts of Western Europe. Nonetheless, it became apparent that simply being a member of an economically oppressed, quote-unquote, class wasn't going to be enough for people to be encouraged to rise up and throw off their oppressors. And so in the middle of the 20th century, philosophers in the so-called Frankfurt School, so-called because of its connection with the university in Frankfurt, Germany, began to apply Marx's analyses of economic and political status, really, to other spheres of life, like race or gender, and so on. And so instead of saying, well, as Marx did, you're the poor, oppressed workers, you should rise up and throw off the shackles of the rich bourgeoisie oppressors. The Frankfurt School applied the analysis, let's say, and most significantly really in the West, at least in the mid and late 20th century, to issues of race, so-called, black and white, encouraging black oppressed people to rise up and throw off the oppression of their white oppressive overlords. And in effect, this had great attraction because it turns out that those cultural factors had a greater purchase on people's view of themselves, if you like. And so the Frankfurt School generated a whole range of different spectra, rather, of oppressor, classes in which people were encouraged to locate themselves. Now, the uprising that was envisaged by the Frankfurt School was not to be altogether peaceful. One of the most prominent, in fact, the leading member of the Frankfurt School for a while, Herbert Marcuse, you may have heard of, wrote an essay in 1965 called Repressive Tolerance, in which he argued that physical violence, though theoretically reprehensible on ethical grounds, was nonetheless justified if it was exercised by the oppressed against their oppressors. And in the particular example he gives in this essay, Repressive Tolerance, is by political conservatives being the oppressors. It's justified for the oppressed political progressives to rise up with physical violence against their capitalist, right-wing conservative oppressors. Now, the best way to get into that essay, well, you could just grab it off the internet or from the book in which it was published, but there's a series of podcasts by James Lindsay in which he just reads through the essay and comments on it. Again, it's a New Discourses podcast. Really well worth reading. It was a few months ago when he went through it. But taking all that together, what you've got is class consciousness in which people are encouraged not just to think of themselves as influenced by, but their identity determined by their membership of one or more classes, and the oppressed to rise up, if necessary, with violence against their ideological and cultural oppressors. Now, alongside this development, you've got the rise in the mid and late 20th century of postmodernism. And at this point, we turn to Michel Foucault, who in many ways is the father of postmodernism. He's known for the claim that, to put it most simply, truth equals power. To put it more in a more nuanced and precise way, all claims to truth are in fact disguised attempts to wield political power. The background here is the postmodern insistence that either there's no such thing as absolute objective truth, or if there is, it can't be known with any certainty. And so when people make claims which look like truth claims in history or the sciences or the social sciences, or just claims about how we should behave in the modern world or whatever it is, in fact what they're trying to do is to disguise attempts at manipulation or attempts to impose power as truth claims in order to legitimate them. And so the proper aim then of all discourse, all discussion, should not aim at trying to find the truth of any proposition in politics or history or science or the social sciences or in how a business ought to be run or anything like that. The proper aim of all discourse, rather, is to unmask how the manipulation is being done. That's what's known as deconstruction. To deconstruct a truth claim in postmodern parlance is to expose how this claim to truth is being used to keep the oppressors in their positions of power over against the oppressed. Now, add to that the work of Derek Bell. Derek Bell was he was the first black man to be a Harvard law professor. He was in the 50s. No, not 50s, later than that, 70s. 1950s was the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which he commented on. But Derek Bell insists, he analysed the way in which these different groups, particularly black versus white, as he characterised it, how the oppression-oppressor narrative made itself felt in legal contexts. I mentioned the Brown versus Board of Education decision. You remember the US Supreme Court in 1954 ruled against the separate but equal doctrine that had prevailed before that, and insisted that those facilities were inherently unjust and unequal, and they violated the 14th Amendment. Well, Derek Bell claimed that actually that decision was motivated by cynical self-interest on the part of the white oppressors who made it. The reason was because racism, he insisted, is the ordinary state of society. It's not that mostly people are good people, but then occasionally they do racist things. If they're white people, they're ordinarily racist. Therefore, this decision, the decision of the Supreme Court, was a racist decision. And indeed, even when it looked like it was an attempt to further the cause and increase equality between black and white people at that stage in American history, in fact, it was motivated by the attempt of white people to forward their own interests. Now, he coined the term critical race theory to refer to his theoretical framework for this. There's a whole bunch more detail which we could go into, which probably shouldn't do here. But it's he who first coined the term critical race theory to refer to this framework. And so, of course, what that means then is that in every context, if you buy into that picture, you're not asking the question, is racist behavior present in this interaction? Rather, what you're saying is, well, we know that racist behavior is involved here. The question is, where is it? And you find that kind of thing making its way into the modern critical social justice seminars. We'll have more on that another time. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw was a student of Derek Bell, and she took his analysis on one step further to make the additional claim that, as well as being defined by, let's say, black, white, male, female, all these other different oppressed, oppressor polarities, different groups that we're members of, we are also members of multiple groups all at the same time. And the membership of multiple oppressed groups intensifies and accentuates the sense of oppression that people experience in day-to-day life. She coined the term intersection to refer to this phenomenon. So, for example, a white man, like myself, exists at the intersection of white as opposed to black and male as opposed to female. By contrast, a black lady, black woman, exists at the intersection of two oppressed group identities, black and female. And remember, it's he and those who went before him in this school of thought who insisted that those things define a person, and moreover that being a member of more than one oppressed group doesn't just add the oppressed characteristics, it, so to speak, multiplies them. The critique that she made is interesting. At one point, she critiques the postmodern framework which preceded her, whereas Foucault and those in his school of thought had insisted that the aim of all discourse is to deconstruct the power claims that are implicit in the truth claims that are being made. She pointed out that, well, those who are oppressed, or she claimed that those who are oppressed, especially those who exist at the intersection of multiple oppressed identities, can't deconstruct their plight. They don't have the social power to do so. And so another way of looking at it is the one thing that is objectively true in all human interactions and in all human history is the existence of the oppression of the marginalized. And the aim of all of life, then, has to turn on the exposure of that oppression. The only objective thing in the world is the oppression of the oppressed. And this is then picked up in the contemporary social justice movement in a way that I'll highlight in just a second. But just to summarize where we've got to, you add all this together and you sort of follow the train of thought as it's been accumulating. You've got a picture in which all people are defined not by their individual identity, not by the individual characteristics, who they are as human beings individually, or by the fact that we're all human and we share that identity all with one another. We're rather defined by our membership of various overlapping and intersecting oppressed or oppressor groups. Within that framework, it's inevitable that all white people are racist, all men are sexist, all straight people are homophobic, and so on. And the aim of all of life is the pursuit of, or should be, the pursuit of social justice. That is, the eradication of this injustice. The aim of all of life is that, has to be. Paradoxically, any attempt by the oppressors to forward that social justice agenda is subject to the criticism that it's not only doomed to fail, but it's motivated by cynical self-interest and actually compounds the injustice it's seeking to put forward, seeking to oppose. There's no possibility of reasoned discussion. After all, Foucault's right. There's no knowledge, there's only power. And so anybody who says, well, look, let's sit down and talk about this, is simply trying to forge a context in which their power can be cemented by truth claims which are in fact nothing of the sort. They're just disguised political claims. Any attempt to push back against criticism of you personally, if like me, for example, you're a white man and you attempt to argue that you're not sexist and you're not racist, well, that would just be taken as evidence of your guilt, or even to quote, I think it's Robin DiAngelo, white fragility. You're so brittle and unable to take this criticism and just remain silent, that your protestations of innocence are evidence of your fragility. And in the end, even physical violence is legitimate in the pursuit of the social justice that we're all required to engage in. Now, it's just amazing to me, in one sense, this is going to be felt everywhere where it's not opposed. In today's world, you've increasingly got companies, entities in the commercial space that are jumping fully on board with the critical social justice movement. And where you'll find this, let's say if you work for Starbucks, you will have at some point, excuse me a sec, you work for Starbucks, you will at some point have been put on a social justice training seminar or some kind of diversity awareness seminar or unconscious bias training seminar or something. In fact, I think Starbucks closed all its stores about a year and a bit ago to put all of its staff through these training programs in the pursuit of social justice. Now, how that happened was by somebody or some group of people making their way into the decision-making structures of the company and pointing out that we're not doing enough as a company to oppose the injustice that is inherent in our white, male, cis-normative, capitalist hegemony. And so what we need to do is to become aware of our racism, become aware of our inherent sexism, and we need to train our employees to recognize their complicity in this guilt. Now, what the Starbucks executives who allowed this apparently don't realize is that won't be enough for the critical social justice advocates. At some point, this is my prediction for the day, okay? At some point, in 5 to 10 years' time, there's going to be a board meeting at Starbucks or American Airlines or somewhere, some company that's pushing these agendas. And somebody's going to ask, so how much of our budget are we spending on anti-racist diversity training and critical social justice training and so on? And the budget manager for the board or whoever's responsible for setting budgets is proudly going to say something like, well, we're spending 4% of revenue on these programs, thinking that will be enough. And the critical social justice advocates, who by then will be in the boardroom, will look back with horror and say, well, what on earth are we spending the other 96% on? Do we not realize that devoting ourselves to anything other than critical social justice activism is morally culpable, it's morally reprehensible, and we are participating in an injustice? That's going to be the claim that's made. And it's just astonishing in the sense that the naivety of companies that are seeking to be progressive in this kind of way and don't realize where they are literally, not literally, metaphorically sawing off the branch that their company is built on. You think you work for an airline or you think you work for a coffee shop. In some of these cases, you don't anymore. You work for an entity whose role in the world is to forward this critical social justice agenda. Now, most people who identify in some way with this movement and are not aware of this, they've been hoodwinked by the terminology, which is deliberately designed to obfuscate and bring confusion to the debate. And we'll get to that later in this book by Pincourt, where he identifies different people, there's different points on the spectrum of woke advocacy. But we've got to be clear at this point. This movement is not going to stop until it's either won, which it won't in the end, or it's completely defeated. And I do think that the gospel is the only hope for its defeat, but I do think as Christians we need to think a little harder than, I need to think harder and work harder at figuring out how that defeat is going to be brought about. Jesus is going to win in history, and he's going to win in and through his church, faithfully seeking to promote and proclaim the gospel to the world. And we need to promote and proclaim the gospel to the world in ways which stand against the actual problems, the actual ideological opposition to the gospel that we face, not some imaginary opposition, which means taking seriously what this ideology has to say. Okay, so let me just jump back into this book, and I'm going to give you a brief now summary of how Charles Pincourt describes where this has brought us to. And you'll recognize in this echoes of some of the philosophical and historical background that I've just sketched for you. I know it's complex and tangled, and there's a whole bunch more that we could have talked about and didn't, but hopefully you'll recognize in what I'm about to read and then comment on echoes of what I've just said. And then I think by the end of that, we'll all be ready for a break, and we'll call this podcast to a halt, and we'll be back next time. But Pincourt highlights 3 principles which he says, quote, bind the many different flavors of woke together. He calls them, and I'm quoting now from page 4, paragraph 123, the knowledge principle, the political principle, and the subject principle. So again, the terminology will be unfamiliar to you. This is how Charles Pincourt characterizes the end result of the philosophical development through history that I've just described. 3 principles. First, the knowledge principle, quote, There are a few important elements to the knowledge principle. The first is that while reality itself is not denied or questioned, it is considered impossible for us to know its true nature. Echoes of postmodernism, Foucault, you see that? Quote again. The reason it's impossible for us to know about reality's true nature is that any knowledge we think we have is actually only socially constructed, defined through language by the culture in which we live. See, that's postmodernism in a nutshell. That's Foucauldianism. Quote again. Critical for this perspective is the fact that different cultures have different understandings about the nature of the world. After examining the political principle, the importance of this last point will be clearer. Right, so that's postmodern epistemology. Knowledge of the world is not possible. There is still an objective world, at least some postmodernists think that. I think he's being slightly generous here. But it can't be known objectively. All knowledge is socially constructed. Second then, the political principle, quote, is that not only is knowledge socially constructed, but knowledge is constructed by oppressor groups in society at the expense of oppressed groups, unquote. So again, you recognize echoes of Foucault. It's strongly influenced by postmodernism. You could even describe the woke movement as applied postmodernism. It has been described in that way. Quote, the construction of knowledge is done through language whose rules are also determined by groups with the power to do so, i.e. oppressor groups. So it's very common, for example, to find science described as a white, male, Western paradigm. He'll say something about science in a moment or two. And what's being claimed by that? Well, when you hear somebody claim that science is a white, Western, male paradigm, behind that is the postmodern insistence that no system of thought, scientific or anything else, can give access to objective truth. All of it is socially constructed, in this case by oppressive, white, male, Western. Remember Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, and of course Herb Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, oppressive groups within society at the expense of the oppressed. Moreover, knowledge is constructed in such a way that helps maintain the oppressive role for oppressor groups and to prevent oppressed groups being liberated from their oppression. Again, you see the echoes of postmodernism, and you see therefore why social justice activists do not want to engage in conversation. They do not want to engage in conversation with somebody who says, well, let's sit down and figure out the truth of things, because such a claim is simply the attempt to exercise political power by the oppressed under the guise of, let's say, historic or scientific claims. Now, Pincourt talks a little bit more about this, and I want to read the next paragraph, still on page 5. It's the third paragraph down. Let me read it, but this and make a comment or two about it, because at this point, there's an additional feature that Christians ought to be aware of, because it's a weakness of our own way of thinking about these matters. This is taken to imply, he continues, that not only is any knowledge socially constructed, but it is by definition biased and can't be an accurate representation of reality. We've seen that already. Continues. This, together with the fact that different cultures have different understandings of the nature of the world, implies that no worldview is more authoritative than any other. As such, all worldviews are, epistemically, equivalent in terms of their ability to know anything about reality and amount simply to different stories about reality. No worldview, in other words, this is me commenting on him, no worldview can claim to have any objective insight into the way things are that some other worldview doesn't have. That is just another story about the real world. There is no path to objective knowledge of the truth of anything. So, for example, now here is the point at which Christians, like us, need to think really, really carefully about what he's saying. So, for example, the scientific worldview has no greater claim to understanding reality than any other story. That is, a scientific worldview is no truer than a religious worldview or even than a superstitious worldview. That's the point he's criticizing. He's criticizing the claim made by critical social justice advocates that the scientific worldview has no privilege over religious or superstitious worldviews. And at this point, of course, Christians, we find ourselves wanting to look in both directions at once. We find ourselves thinking, hold on, I don't like the idea of being lumped in with superstitious. And I also agree that there are aspects of life, there are questions about the world to which my religious, quote unquote, worldview does give accurate, truthful answers that a scientific worldview cannot give. There are many religious questions, quote unquote, that as Christians we want to talk about, where we think science has given us wrong answers. And so what are we supposed to do about this? Well, the answer is to make some careful distinctions and think as clearly as we can about what's true about these claims and what's false about them. That is, what's true about the claims that are being criticized here and what's false about them. So, where might it be the case that we want to criticize scientific overreach, say? Where is it that we'd want to say something which is not in agreement with critical social justice ideology, but which nonetheless pushes back against scientific hegemony? Well, at least two contexts. There are specific theories that are wrong and which are sustained by ideological concerns. You could even say, and I hesitate to say this, but to put it most provocatively, here's an example where the end result of the claims of social justice ideology are actually right. That some scientific claims are not true in themselves and are sustained by ideological or political power, their attempts, rather, let me put this more precisely, they are disguised attempts to leverage ideological or political power. So let's say Darwinism. I happen to think that Darwinism is just false. I don't think that Darwinism provides an explanation for the origin of biological diversity, much less human life in the world. I just don't think it's true. And I think it's been demonstrated that there are, even just from a scientific standpoint, Stephen C. Meyer, for example, has demonstrated profound and fundamental mathematical and information theoretic problems with Darwinian evolution. And these are not taken seriously in the scientific mainstream, not because they're bad scientific arguments, but they're not taken seriously in the scientific mainstream because of ideological concerns to protect scientism, which I think is a better word for what's going on here, from ideological, or in this case, Christian challenge. So at one level, I want to say there are contexts in which, yes, a scientific worldview is no truer than a scientific worldview, or in fact, more precisely, the claims of the Christian worldview are right and the claims of some scientists are wrong. But there's another case in which we have to be careful how we approach this. That's where you've got a scientific theory which might be right, but which is being leveraged politically. And of course, the obvious case we're all thinking of here in late 2021 are some branches of medicine, specifically related to vaccines, quantitative epidemiology, so in other words, measuring the growth and the spread of pandemics. It seems clear, let me say something uncontroversial, okay? It seems pretty clear that there is such a thing as this COVID stuff that's going around. But at the same time, it seems abundantly obvious that it's being leveraged politically. And I don't know whether this gets this podcast cancelled from YouTube. We'll see, won't we? See how good their artificial intelligence audio filters are. But anyway, we do want to say, we want to somewhat de-privilege the absoluteness of a scientific materialist outlook on life, because it can either be politically leveraged or it can be just plain wrong. But at the same time, here's another danger on the other side for Christians, that we end up being skeptical about every kind of scientific claim, and we make ourselves vulnerable to being sucked into a critical social justice framework. It goes like this. Critical social justice says science has massively overreached and doesn't have any greater purchase on the truth than other, let's say, religious outlooks on the world. And we find ourselves wanting to say, yeah, I agree with that. And so you get sucked into a critical social justice mindset. And in the process, you don't only buy into a whole bunch of toxic ideology coming from critical social justice activists, we also end up just plain wrong in the science. And the most obvious example of this, of course, is how some of our Christian friends think about homeopathy. Whatever you might say about, let's say, there are herbal remedies that work, right? Plenty of herbal remedies that work. But I was reading the other day about a homeopathic treatment for flu called Oscillo. I think it's the technical name is oscillococcinum, which is a 10 to the 400th power dilution of an extract of duck liver. Now, a dilution that great means that there is not the slightest possibility of any of the duck liver being in any of the tablets that you take. There are only 10 to the 82 atoms in the known universe, so there's no way that a dilution of 10 to the 400th power is going to have any of the medicine in it. And so anybody who claims that that works because you're receiving any kind of treatment just doesn't know what they're talking about. If you don't know what the numbers mean, then well, please don't spend your money on it. But the point to be made there is that a lot of Christians buy into that framework of, in that case, medicine, because of a skepticism about science, and the same skepticism about science will make them vulnerable to critical social justice reasoning. And so there's a kind of complex lack of awareness of some of these issues. In fact, the truth is that some scientific tools, not the scientific worldview per se, but some scientific tools are a better guide to truth in some domains. And the reason they are is because, properly understood, scientific tools are a product of the Christian worldview rather than in opposition to it. So all that is to say, just a parenthesis on the comment that he makes: a scientific worldview is no truer than a religious worldview. We have to think as carefully as we can about what's right about that claim and what's wrong about it. Otherwise, we end up making ourselves vulnerable to all kinds of foolishness. Finally, and briefly we'll do this, the subject principle, quote, is that individuals are primarily defined by their group identity, brackets, white, female, black, European, cisgendered, etc. That is to say that they are subjected to their group identity in society, which is why I call this the subject principle. This is how the post-structuralists, also known as the high postmodernists, often referred to individuals, i.e. as subjects. He continues, this implies that people are oppressed or oppressors according to what group or groups they are identified with. Similarly, it implies that how people behave is primarily a function of group identity and, taken together with the political principle, that their behavior supports and helps perpetuate the oppressive systems around them unconsciously. Echoes of Derek Bell, but taken to the next step. A white person, for example, he continues, simply can't help but behave in ways that perpetuate their oppression over non-white people in society. Importantly, it also implies that black people behave in such a way that perpetuates their oppression, although from a different perspective. So what's going on here? This is group identity and identity politics being screwed down and, again, amplified to the next level, where it becomes clear that one's group identity not only determines who you are as a person, but how you behave, and even a moral evaluation of your actions. Next paragraph on top of page 6, and we're going to finish with this. A corollary of this principle is that since individual behavior is defined by one's identity, individuals are responsible or accountable for actions associated with any identity to which they are associated. That's what I mean by the concentrated, high-intensity prose. There's a lot there to think about. It means that a white person is guilty of doing things that other white people are accused of doing, even in the past. As such, the oppressive acts of one member of a group is the oppressive act of all members of that group. This accountability is valid across time. The oppressive act of a member of a group at one time can be attributed to a group identity and therefore to its members at another time. And that's what lies behind all the stuff that you've been hearing recently about reparations and so on. Why would you expect somebody today to pay reparations for actions that were done before they were even born? Well, it's simple, because your identity and therefore your moral standing in society is determined exhaustively by the group of which you're a member. And therefore you're morally culpable for actions committed by that group. Okay, I think we've had enough of this. Just to recap what we've done, we've begun just with a brief introduction to the book. This book that I've mentioned already, Counter Wokecraft by Charles Pincourt, James Lindsay, is the best practical guide that I've found for dealing with this stuff. And I've given you a brief rundown of its strengths, its weaknesses, at a little bit of length, and I apologize for that. I've given what it lacks, that is some kind of historical survey of where the critical social justice movement is coming from. And then finally, I've taken you through the first short section in chapter 1, the three principles that summarize the woke worldview. We're going to come back next time, and I'll take you a little bit further through how he describes both the character of this ideology and then how it functions in the world. And then after that, we'll get on to how to deal with practically with it in the workplace and elsewhere. But I think that's a good place to stop for now. God bless, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.